Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to A Fork in Time. This is Chris Coppola. I'm joined today by Dylan Holzemer and Eric Rush. I think when we get to it, I think we've been talking off. This might be a dream team for this topic. We've really got like the best. This is the all-star team. Is that a fair assessment, guys?
Well, for this topic, I think we've probably got the right personnel, and to me, this is the strength of the Fork in Time team is that everybody has sort of overlapping areas of expertise and just unified by our love of history and yeah, I think for tonight, I think we've got the good group.
So, Dylan, do you want to chip in a little bit?
Yeah, I was going to say I think. We do have the trifecta, although one always has to remember that we're still at least a priest or a rabbi and one other party short of a real joke to lead the podcast in. So we do still have some work to do. I don't want anybody to get too ahead of ourselves before we've reached true perfection here.
We are very close to a walk in a bar joke.
So, there's a prohibition comment to be made about that for later on.
Well, I guess
yeah,
we are.
That'll come back in a second. So today we are going to talk about the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, which did lead to the passing of prohibition, tangential at this point to what we're talking about. But I mean, let's face it, like that kind of just had to be thrown in there. So going to start a little bit, Woodrow Wilson came to office in 1912, 1913 is when he assumed office because of a split in the Republican Party. We actually did an episode on the progressive, the Bull Moose Party. This is Teddy Roosevelt running against William Howard Taft. They split the Republican vote. And for only the second candidate, third time since the Civil War, the other being Grover Cleveland, a Democrat actually wins the presidency because the Republicans, formed a circular firing squad and decided to take each other out. So, Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about who wound up winning that presidential election?
Well, it was Woodrow Wilson in 1912, and that was not a foregone conclusion. And I think we're not going to spend as much time on the 1912 election. We're going to focus a little more on what happened after the 1916 election, but we're going to be talking a lot about Woodrow Wilson. And the reason why we have the personnel we do tonight is because Wilson's medical history is going to play a pretty big part in what's going to be our ultimate fork. What we know is that Woodrow Wilson, over the course of his presidency and even before his presidency, was not a well man. We don't really know for sure. So, and I will say this, I love history. I love medicine. I practice medicine. And the intersection of history and medicine is a really challenging topic. And partly is just because our ability to do diagnosis and accurate diagnosis is so much better now than it was in the past. And so we have to kind of make some guesses for people in the who might be suffering from something in the past. And so what we know is that Wilson probably started having strokes pretty young, probably around the age of 40. And that over the next few years, he had several strokes. And even before president, he could have had as many as 6 strokes. And that is a big deal. We also know that as president, he probably had at least 4 additional strokes. And so that, which strikes us as kind of crazy that a candidate for president could have had as many as 10 strokes in his life. The last of which was pretty incapacitating. And that's going to, we'll come back to that when we talk about the fork. but we know that he was not a well man. We also know that there were some inciting factors that went into some of the more severe strokes. Number one, very likely the stress that was a result of World War I, specifically the U.S. involvement in World War I and the aftermath of this. And then additionally, there were intercurrent illnesses that he had. We've known for centuries that that infections, like pneumonia in particular, can prompt people to have heart attacks and can prompt people to have strokes. We know that in Paris during the peace talks, he had influenza. And so we suspect that may have had something to do with some of the worst strokes that he had, as well as the kind of barnstorming that he had around the United States, though he was trying to build support for the League of Nations, in which his stroke, his most debilitating stroke happened, mere days after he finished that. Which, as I recall, that the last of those barnstorming events occurred in Wichita, Kansas, not far from me. So he had a lot of things on his plate that preceded his catastrophic stroke while president, which happened on October 3rd, 1919. And this happened pretty close to towards the end of his presidency, 6+ years into his 8-year term. But there was a lot that happened subsequent to that. There were cover-ups by his medical personnel. I would argue that even with the technology and the knowledge of the time, he was not handled expertly for his stroke, and that his physician and his wife at the time were probably complicit in keeping some pretty significant things, not only a secret from the public, but secret from the vice president, and secret from the cabinet, and secret from Congress. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dylan, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the constitutional issues and the potential for constitutional crisis that this did present, and also that the constitutional crisis, a fork in time, could present. So Dylan, all yours.
So there's a funny thing about American history in that the way everybody knows how it works now is the minority rule in terms of historically how it has always worked. Presidential incapacitation or death, dismemberment, what have you, has generally been governed for most of American history by Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, which is about 35 of the most flowery, useless words describing how to succeed in office. Basically, the original plan for presidential succession, if the president died or resigned or was out for the count for whatever reason, basically said the vice president gets to do it, and we're not going to bother to tell you how. The only reason that there was any kind of even real precedent was because John Tyler, when he was vice president, he just decided when his president died and it was Tyler's time to step into the spotlight, he just started calling himself president and doing things before anybody had a chance to get their act together and call him on it. And everybody just kind of followed that rule ever since. So in Wilson's case, you have a stroke that he ends up being basically shut behind a door with only 2 people between him and the world for 14 months. This is the longest presidential incapacitation in American history by far. The longest one that's close to it is 81 days before Garfield finally died after his assassination. So you have a doctor and a first lady who are essentially complicit and ran the country while there was no president. Dr. Grayson was the doctor's name. He and Edith Wilson, basically, they didn't even tell Wilson how serious his stroke was at first. There were periods where he was bedridden and they were, he couldn't even feed himself. Edith took all communications with him. Basically, she decided what was important enough for him. So this is, for over a year, the United States does not have a functioning head of government. And when the cabinet tried to ask about what they were going to do, who was going to take charge, Grayson, his doctor, refused upon request to sign a certification of disability that would then allow the vice president to assume the powers of the presidency, execute all of the duties of the office to maintain and run the country. They said, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to do everything because it's totally Woodrow Wilson. I don't know if listeners may have seen the TV show Drunk History, but there's an episode that actually talks about this stroke of Wilson's. And basically the way that the TV show portrays it is that Edith Wilson is propping Wilson up in bed and waving his arms around like he's a marionette.
I mean, no. If we are going to take popular culture references to this, there is only one place to go.
A Weekend at Bernie's.
Is to
I know you're going there.
Yes, absolutely.
But basically, but the point that I'm trying to make is that like all of these images that you have in your head of basically a president who's being run like a puppet, they're hyperbolic, but only to an extent. They're very much real things. Edith actually, this is kind of a random aside, but she actually, she always swore up until her dying day that everything she did, she ran past Woodrow and that he made a decision on everything. She did admit that there was at least one time when Woodrow Wilson vetoed the Volstead Act. The signature was Edith's. She basically signed for Woodrow by permission, like an attorney does for somebody else in his office.
By the way, we've done it. We brought it back. I promised we would do it later, sooner than I expected. What was the effect of the Volstead Act?
Honestly, since it was vetoed, I don't even remember. But
the Volstead Act
it was prohibition.
That was the law actually establishing to perpetuate walks into a bar jokes. Really,
exactly.
Until this entire thing basically kept walked into a bar jokes a thing.
Yeah. So basically, the long and the short of it is you have basically an unprecedented sort of vacuum in presidential politics where you have a president who refuses or is unable to even vacate his office. And, this isn't a situation that would get rectified until after JFK was assassinated. So, even after Wilson, when everybody should have probably learned the lesson, Roosevelt was out for various things. Dwight Eisenhower, he and Nixon had to have a whole memo that was signed off on by the Attorney General for whenever Ike would have, surgeries that would put him out, because Article 2 was the only vague thing that governed. And, it's just crazy that such an amazing, function of the government was just sort of left haphazardly and everybody was sort of shrugging. What's really crazy is that it could have even gotten crazier because depending on when Wilson could have had his stroke, if he could have actually been elected while he was incapacitated from a stroke, not really kind of sort of ceremonially sworn in with a doctor's note, and basically taken the office of the presidency while bedridden with his wife and his doctor running the country. And there is literally zero constitutional prohibition on paper from doing that.
And no mechanism for fixing this issue, and knowing that the time between the election and the inauguration in 1913 or 1917 was longer than it is now. So presidents are sworn in on January 20th now of the year following their election. At this point it was March 4th. I mean, or say it was usually March 4th. There are exceptions which are kind of interesting for us to explore, but it was generally March 4th, and so there were several months that there were sort of this gray zone where you have a sitting president that was also a president-elect, and so which this is 1917. Gosh, a lot's going on in 1917.
Yeah, if you've already heard the medical discussion of somebody dying, that's what Eric is here for. If you've heard a constitutional crisis, that's what Dylan's here for. If you're hearing my voice, it's probably a world war. We're right in the middle of a world war. So yeah.
Hey, Chris, if we have somebody else here that has a defined function, can we call ourselves the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse?
I feel like for most of the, I'm going to call it global South, Alexis is another horseman.
Oh, well, okay. So in that case, we will be the
four horse people,
the four people of the apocalypse.
Yes.
Yes.
I believe the correct term is centaur.
Is that right?
No, not at all.
Oh,
No,
all right.
the centaur is like a half
Horse people.
man, half horse. Yeah.
Anyway, bad joke.
Centaur of the North, actually, another name for Pancho Villa. And you guys are laughing about that right now. I'll try. We really should get back to recording our off podcast topics, because some of these things are good ones. However,
really
yeah, that was a nice tie-in. World War One begins 1914. Imperial Germany, Austria fighting Russia, France, Britain. Right up until this time, and it goes back and forth and stalemate, whatever, all fight on the Western Front. The movie, I have huge issues with that movie. I'm not going to get into it. It's a decent movie. It just shouldn't be called that. Whatever. Anyway, stuff starts getting real about now. About now being March 1917. Wilson won election in 1912. He won election again in 1916, promising to keep America out of the European War. That lasted about 31 days after his second inauguration. And one of the reasons was the German resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which basically means submarines will sink whatever ship they want anywhere around the British Isles in an attempt to starve out the British. You do have mutinies starting right now in the French army. And then you have, and I can get into the old style versus new style calendar, but we don't need to. For some reason, the February Revolution starts in the middle of March, which overthrows the Romanovs, and eventually Bolsheviks come to power. Russia leaves. About this time, the United States has declared war because of the unrestricted submarine warfare. A lot of American ships are sunk because of that. There's also something called the Zimmerman Telegram that comes out, which is a proposal by Germany to give the military dictator of Mexico at this point, Victoriano Huerta, give him back the territories the United States took from Mexico during the Mexican-American War, except for the fact that Huerta is in the middle of being overthrown himself. He will actually be on a boat to Spain before the end of World War I. Anyway, Bolsheviks come to power, Russia leaves, the United States actually, and we've talked about this before, there's a bit of a lead time between when the United States actually declares war and when it has any effect whatsoever in Europe. During the intervening period, a lot of the American army is in northern Mexico hunting the centaur of the north. There we go. We got that reference in there. And there's a bingo card for those of you following along at home. We'll try and circulate that. And the United States gets troops in. Germany finally starves, surrenders. End of World War I. Wilson is the first American president to go to Europe while serving to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, comes back and has to politically campaign to get the United States Senate to ratify this treaty. The stress of this and just the stress of being in Kansas, apparently, triggers a major stroke on his part, and Wilson is incapacitated. We talked about this, and we talked about a really good fork, we thought. Somebody want to jump in, and what do we think triggers? We don't want to put a medical diagnosis on it, but triggers the medical emergency we're talking about.
No, I'll put a medical diagnosis on it. So for people with existing cerebrovascular disease, it's, strokes can happen at any time. And so with his history, it is not at all unusual that Wilson could have had a debilitating stroke in 1917 instead of 1919. And in this case, it would be as a result of the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, or any number of other things that happened in early 1917 that could have prompted this. And so I think that is entirely plausible. And if anything, considering its history, maybe even more likely than what happened in our timeline, where nothing additional happened until 1919 that we're aware of. So I think we say that the stroke happened about 30 months ahead of time.
Dylan, you were looking up the exact timeline of this. You were saying February, right?
So February 1st, Germany resumes, or they announce that they're resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. Later that month, there's a rather dramatic telegram that gets intercepted. February 22nd, I think, is the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, where the Germans tried to entice, bribe Mexico into entering on behalf of the Central Powers by basically striking a dagger in the back of the United States. So that's, you can see the dramatic sort of Hollywood moment of Wilson, hearing of the Zimmermann telegram, like FDR getting the Tora, Tora, Tora notice and then just killing over, But me personally, I think he could have just have easily, been eating, his favorite Virginia ham on a Tuesday morning, and he just decides to keel over one day.
So here's the thing we talked about. If this happens in, let's say, February 2nd, it's announced first, news gets to him on the 2nd. Is he president yet? He is serving out his 1912 term.
He is president, and he is also president-elect. But, Dylan.
So there is the 25th, Article 2 does, obviously it says that in the event the president is incapacitated, which you would argue that Wilson is very much incapacitated, the vice president assumes the duties. That requires some nebulous processes. So at this point, Wilson is kind of president and not president. He hasn't been sworn into his 17 term is really what it is, even though the election's in 16. But there's no constitutional requirement that there has to be a sort of formal swearing in ceremony with the Chief Justice and all of that. So you could certainly imagine a world where, just like in the real timeline in 1919 and 1920, Edith Wilson and Dr. Grayson kind of kept Wilson behind doors. You can certainly imagine that there's still a world where Wilson essentially becomes the president by doctor's note. Essentially, they can create, whether it's an influenza thing or something else that keeps him bedridden and unable to attend. It's still perfectly constitutionally acceptable for him to be, quote unquote, sworn in. And even in the middle of a massive stroke or what have you, he can still become, constitutionally speaking, the president of the United States as of March the 4th, 1917, for his second term. And then the question is what does that do? That uncertainty, that inability, do to the rest of World War I and beyond? Because obviously, Wilson, asked Congress to declare war in the war to end all wars. That's very hard to do in a Weekend at Bernie's situation. I don't know how Edith's impersonation of her husband's voice was. I doubt it was probably that good.
As I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, James Madison, when asking for the declaration of war in 1812, sent a note to Congress asking them to approve it. I don't know that that was an actual address. But
I don't know, legally, does it matter?
Yeah. No, I don't think there's a requirement. But the other question is, would they have taken that policy? He just got elected saying, I will keep us out of war. And one of the major things in our timeline is they being Edith Wilson and the doctor are actively, to some extent, the one person more than anyone else they're trying to keep in the dark is Thomas Marshall, who would assume the presidency as the vice president. He was an open interventionist. He wants to get involved. So you can see an argument to be made that they will prevaricate. They will kick this down the road. They will not act and get the United States involved. One, while its ships, while American ships are being attacked, American ships had already been attacked, this isn't quite a, like you mentioned, the Tora situation. This is Wilson asking, in our timeline, Wilson asked for a declaration of war. You could easily see Edith and what was the doctor?
Grayson.
Kicking this can down the road, because he had recovered from previous strokes. And even though this was a relatively serious one, could you see them say, well, we just need to wait. We need to let him restore his health. We need to let him get back. And once he is back, then we can face these issues. Is that?
It's possible. Strokes are funny in that, and I will say, if we're looking at this through the 2023 lens, we have better tools now, than both in terms of clinical ascertainment and imaging and physical examination, that will allow us a little better ability to predict what is likely to happen in terms of a meaningful recovery. None of those things existed at that time, but I think as a general statement, yes, it is possible for people to recover meaningfully from even a severe stroke. So it's on the table.
And so they just keep putting this off as long as they possibly can. And in our timeline, they were basically able to do it for, I think you mentioned 14 months. And the reason they stopped is because there was another election. This wasn't a discovery. This wasn't oh my God, somebody cut the president's strings and they realized his hand can't move anymore. There was just the very natural process of our democracy. There was another election. Wilson had already served 2 terms. Somebody else ran and was elected. And that's when that's when Grayson and Edith Wilson stopped making decisions, basically. So you could see them kicking this down the road, right?
Absolutely.
Here's where it gets really important, because I threw in, and I think this is the more important one, but Dylan certainly made a very important point about, at this point on the Western Front, basically it had devolved into stalemate. The Germans largely kind of sat back, other than Verdun, sat back and let the French and the British bleed themselves white by charging at well-prepared German defenses. And by spring 1917, Nivelle, a French general, came up with a brilliant idea to just, if brute force isn't working, you're just not using enough of it. So let's try this again. And the French army had other ideas. They did not do what we'll get to in a second about the Russian army. They just said, we're not attacking. They didn't abandon the front. They maintained it and they defended France. They just said, we're not walking into machine gun fire anymore. even that created a lot of political turmoil in France that led to, I believe this is when Clemenceau comes in, isn't it? This led to a collapse of the French government. If not that, very soon after that.
It was very soon after, if it wasn't that.
Mm-hmm. And as I hinted, the Russian army did abandon the front after the February Revolution, which was in March. Literally within weeks of what we're talking about, the Russian army started walking away from the front. Eventually, this leads to the October Revolution that happens in November. I don't know why they can't do anything at the beginning of the month when they actually sync up, but for whatever reason, yeah, that's just how their calendar worked. And in April 1918, just about a year later, the entire Eastern Front of World War I closed. All of the German troops that were busy fighting the Russians, the Romanians, all of that, were freed up. And in our timeline, the Germans rushed those troops to the west. This was the San Miguel Offensive, the Kaiserschlacht, these last couple of desperate gambles because they knew the Americans were coming. Hadn't gotten there yet, but they knew they needed to do something before the Americans got involved. But what if the Americans aren't coming? In this time frame, in this time that we just laid out, nothing about the American paralysis. I think that's a really interesting way to say this. The president and the United States government are paralyzed. The United States government isn't doing anything, isn't actually recruiting, isn't actually getting ready to do anything in Europe. It's distinctly possible we're actually intervening in Mexico because debatably we were attacked there. So that when these troops are freed up, two things, and hopefully you guys are regular listeners and know the answer to this question. Who drew the border between Ukraine and Russia today? It was the Germans at this point, and they drew it intentionally to include as much of Ukraine as they could, including very fertile farmland and a lot of coal, meaning that if they can survive what is called the turnip winter, where Germany is starving because of the British blockade, if they just make it through that, the British blockade means next to nothing because they can import all the food stuff they need from their puppet regime in Ukraine, which they won because of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now what?
And so you have what was so this had been a war of attrition for quite some time in a lot of ways, and because the Germans were fighting a two-front war, and then it wasn't really in their favor. But then all of a sudden it's in their favor, but then it's not in their favor again because you've got Americans coming with capital, materiel, and personnel, but they're not coming.
Right.
And so, the only, I would argue the only interest that the U.S. has at this point is the fact that a lot of the debt that's being held in New York is actually British debt. Mm-hmm. And so we do have at least a vested interest in a soft landing for the United Kingdom. Other than that, it's their problem. And so we're not there. And so you could easily see the war of attrition going a different way and a negotiated peace. Now on the West, is that a white peace? Is that the 1914 borders? Or does Germany get a little more of that, particularly delicious part of northeastern France, other than just Alsace-Lorraine?
First and foremost, I don't think this is a negotiated white peace.
No. I think it's a negotiated peace. I don't think it's a white peace.
Dylan mentioned he used one phrase
Okay.
previously
Yeah.
that I loved, Kaiserreich. He said, "I'm going full Kaiserreich," and
Full Kaiserreich. Okay.
and for those of you unfamiliar, I'm pretty sure I know exactly what he's talking about. A lot of us are pretty well versed in alternative history literature, but there is a video game. Am I right? Am I right, Dylan? Absolutely. That allows one to take control of any country around this time frame and make decisions for them. And it is called Hearts of Iron, and you can actually program different mods and scenarios. And there is one where this happens, and the Germans don't send the troops to the west immediately. They first buttress Turkey, so that the British are driven back from basically Anatolia. They were into Syria. They're driven out of Anatolia. Once that's settled, then they attack France, and the French army is having a lot of problems right now. And the German imperial government wasn't the peacemaking type. They were not the white peace type. I don't know if it would have been more of northern France. It might have been colonies.
Yeah, it could have been both of those things, and so maybe not a white peace, but Germany was not. Even though that you could argue that they had the upper hand here, they were not in great shape.
Right.
At this point, they were not, and like nobody was in great shape. And
nobody was, but the two ticking time bombs of the German situation, the American troops
in the turn of winter,
we've now negated.
Well, with Ukraine, or with at least if we get into what, May of 17, June of 17,
18, because
okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Bolshevik Revolution comes
in October and November. Gotcha. Okay, yes.
And the peace is signed in 1 year later, March 1918.
So you're saying if they could make it until May of 18,
I would say September 18.
Well, you'll start getting a little bit of foodstuffs in the summer, but yeah, so things are looking better by the fall at the very least.
By the fall, I mean the British blockade means absolutely nothing. So I think you could have the possibility of Germany splitting the Allied powers. They definitely have an interest in keeping Britain as somewhat an important nation, especially so that, again, they don't anger the United States, to keep the United States as far on the other side of the Atlantic as possible. So they offer the British, I think they could offer the British status quo ante.
Mm-hmm.
The French are giving up their colonies. The French are going to become a minor continental power.
So all of West Africa?
Sure. Yeah.
Minus Algeria? Or are they giving up Algeria as well?
I think they'll give up Algeria. I mean,
well, Algeria could be a tool to get the United States to sign off on this. Obviously they're disinterested aside from the finances, but you still have enough of Wilson's sort of, even if he's incapacitated, his free determination of people's, Wilsonian liberalism. You could probably, see the Germans using, not just Algiers, but even some of the lesser, French territories as sort of, peace offerings to the United States, literal peace offerings, I suppose you could probably say, just because it lets you throw a bone to Edith and Dr. Grayson, who are interpreting the magic stroke man of Woodrow Wilson, to letting them sign off on a peace with Britain.
So we're not going to take them as colonies.
We're going to do a quote unquote free determination. Yeah.
So I'm not. I think the United States probably is able to get the Western Hemispheric possessions of the French. Caribbean islands, French Guiana, no problem there. Woodrow Wilson did enjoy his Virginia ham because he was from Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And he did screen the first movie ever in the White House.
The Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation. He believed in self-determination. Probably didn't believe in self-determination for anybody on the continent of Africa.
Well, and that's why, I kind of use the phrase in quotes because the other thing you have to think of from the economic side of it is, so, the German-British blockade is probably at least it's going to be around for a while, even if it's semi-unofficial, it may be a sort of quasi-war situation. But by Ukraine being opened up as a German puppet, that's a direct line between Germany and Turkey and the Bosphorus, which gives them a back door. If you start adding Algiers to that, then you have a inconvenient but still functional route from German markets through a presumably double-sided British blockade. Not just a Germans can't get to the Atlantic British blockade, the Atlantic can't get to the Germans blockade. So you now have, just like Eric mentioned earlier with the financial interests of the United States, if Algiers is a quote unquote, free sort of territory, the United States has a direct access to the new most important market in Europe, which is the German Empire. So I think you can, assuming they win, I think you can certainly say that, the United States is going to be just fine as long as they can cash their checks from whoever owes them. They're going to be fine with especially with, the sort of paralyzation. The one thing that the United States is going to care about if they can't do anything else is that the money keeps rolling in. They're going to be fine with letting Germany and Britain just sort of butt heads and France, basically get pulled apart to whatever's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about, now that we're talking about it, I'm thinking about the situation that actually developed in Algiers during the 1950s. The French settler population is probably allowed to keep coastal Algeria as a French possession, as a sop to self-determination, and also from the perspective of, I've never said this before on this podcast, but maybe Wilhelm II wakes up and realizes that taking in a whole bunch of French settlers that are never under any circumstances going to accept German overlordship isn't the best idea. So take Senegal, take West Africa, take the places that, by the way, are not settled by Frenchmen, that you might actually be able to hold, because even the French couldn't hold the French in Algeria.
True.
So we might have Germany winning the First World War if Wilson's heart gave out or triggered a stroke.
We'll say he's permanently incapacitated, whether he dies or not. Well, if he dies, then that's a little bit different can of worms. But if he's incapacitated for long enough for whatever peace occurs over that kind of that 1917 to 1919 time frame, then the post World War I world has been created without him having as much of an imprint on it. So, presumably there is, there's no 14 points.
Right.
And whatever the League of Nations was, it is not anywhere near what it would be. I would say it probably, we'll say, the League of Nations basically dies in infancy, I suspect, if it's even proposed.
Yeah, I don't think it's even proposed.
Because Roosevelt had made some noises about it, so there may have been some form of it.
At least
just even
maybe a discussion, but I don't think it gets
Yeah.
anywhere.
Two things come to mind here. First and foremost, none of this happens without Germany approving it happening. Period.
Yeah.
Two, and this is an interesting argument that I'm going to throw out there first. Germany had, and they hadn't really entered a political settlement of Eastern Europe. Ukraine, Ruthenia, which we would call Belarus, the Baltic states. They had created a kingdom of Poland, and it's an interesting possibility that this, again, if it's any, maybe if Bismarck by some miracle could have survived to this point, and it's not Wilhelm II and pig-headed Prussians making these decisions. But, God, a confederation of nations of Europe solves Austria's problems.
Well, who's to say that they don't turn it into a sort of new Holy Roman Empire?
Well, that's what I was thinking, or some sort of Middle Europa.
Yeah, exactly.
And so does Austria-Hungary? Does that? I mean, I presume that they persist in some fashion as a political entity. That they're not.
I don't know if they do. I think it's Austria. I think the Habsburgs become junior partners of some kind of European Middle Europe. I love that idea of
Austria-Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, what we would call those now that are still, kind of in the fold in some way. Maybe part of some areas like Slovenia that we would consider, or Croatia that we would consider part of future Yugoslavia.
Keep in mind, even the German Empire of this point had, 1919, during those revolutions that swept Germany, you had the abdication of the Bavarian royal family and the House of Würzburg and of Baden-Baden. So you had an overarching, I'm going to call it federal government. Mm-hmm. And you did have distinctively sub-federal units.
Yeah, and I think, based on the way Germany unified in the 1860s, 1870s, I don't think you could have it any other way. I don't think knowing that this was a Prussian-led unification and not a Bavarian-led unification, right? Which I could easily come up with a very plausible alternate history where it was a Bavarian-led, southern German state that became a German empire that was Bavarian-led. That probably.
That's another episode, because I'm going to fight you tooth and nail on that.
I think the Bavarians could unify in another. We can talk about that Bavaria versus. So I will say I have a very small. I have one great grandparent who's from Germany and they're from Bavaria. So I have a little bit of bias there, admittedly.
So I have an interesting question for both of you, since we're talking about the state of Southern and Eastern Europe. Is what do you think happens to Italy in all this mess? Because they're and I'm thinking more towards 20 years down the road, and the inspirations for, even in this universe, a likely rematch of the title fight. Italy in our timeline, they were, sort of the odd ones out, the sort of, redheaded stepchild of World War I on both sides. Do you think that, there's any sort of even resemblance to fascism or something along those lines in Italy, or do you think they take a totally different course after this?
I think if you can have some form of a Middle Europa, I think Italy willingly joins it because it can keep its cultural autonomy while also gaining economic access, as you said, to the biggest market in the entire, maybe the world, or certainly a very important market of Central Europe. And by the way, as becoming part of this, these tiny little towns like Trieste and Fiume and the South Tyrol, they don't matter as much because they're not on the other side. They're inside the second Holy Roman, the second empire, the second. They're part of this Middle European Confederacy rather than being torn away from the body politic.
Yeah, because they were there was land ceded from Austria-Hungary, and it wouldn't have happened, and so you have a slightly smaller Italy. But I agree. I think they would join on. I think you would have a kingdom of Italy that would persist, and I don't think there would be the need for fascism. I think if there's any one country where you would have some very interesting political developments, I think it would be France. And the question is does France? I don't even think the question is, does France stay democratic? Is there a new republic there? Because I think the answer to that is no. I don't think France would be in a very good position at all. And so, does France go fascist or does France go communist?
Have you played the Kaiser Reich?
No.
Are you familiar with what we're talking?
Yeah, I mean a little bit. I don't play very many video games, but I'm familiar with the Hearts of Iron 4. I'm vaguely familiar with the game.
Okay. Dylan, do you have thoughts on that?
So I think obviously France probably is the sort of political dice roll that has to be figured out. Obviously, I don't think it's any question that if there is a second conflict, eventually France is the instigator against Germany. At some point, it's in what form. I'm curious if you don't have the sort of corporatist, fascist influence of Italy, I don't know whether it's more of a, I don't want to say monarchist because everybody else in Europe is monarchist, and so there's no ideological conflict. But you could maybe see. I think you could certainly see some form of communist, if not like a Leninist communist, a sort of Paris Commune type communist, rekindling the old alliance with a Russia that's now the Soviet Union that signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. You've got one half of the old alliance that Bismarck was so careful to not let happen, with France and Russia, Germany, having to fight a two-front war. You get maybe a Schlieffen 2.0, but French somehow. Do you have a reverse attack with communists, or do French communists intervene in the Spanish Civil War?
Well, they probably do, because it's right on their border. And does that affect things? But also, if you feel, let's presume a World War II is going to happen, because of course it does. I mean, the only way Chris and I prevented World War II was with influenza, and so let's assume that it happens. So you've got you've got France and Russia, or France and the Soviet Union as belligerents initially, and then you've got the German Empire. I kind of think that you've got a US and UK probably coming down on the side of Germany in that instance. I would think.
So two things come to mind. First, Pétain saves France by improving the soldiers' soup. I mean, that's literally the level that he went to fight the mutinies that happened. That's one Pétain. Another Pétain comes to mind 23 years later, who basically throws up his hands after defeat and says, this is what 20 years of Bolshevism has gotten us. I think Pétain is positioned in the post-war period to start a hyper-nationalist, revanchist movement, and frankly cleave off a lot of that support that might exist for Marxist, because in French history you do kind of have this pattern of Paris being socialist, Marxist out there, and everybody on the left bank thinking that we have these beautiful ideas and the entire country is going to love them as soon as we hold the next General Assembly election. And as soon as they hold the next General Assembly election, it's conservatives that come in. So I think Pétain's national revanchism and populism, in a way, to connect to the common soldiers might allow a fascist state of some extent, to grow in France, with him as their leader.
So here's an interesting idea that I just thought of. So if you do have that, you then have sort of a reactionary French, axis versus a, advanced technological, because the Germans prior to World War I were sort of the leading technological, cultural sort of up and comer in terms of what was going on. So you now have sort of a modern, I don't want to say technocratic, but that's close to the word, sort of Eastern and Central European monarchic confederation. What if this becomes a war of not religion, but more religious framing? Because although you've got Catholic Austria and Catholic Italy in this confederation, truth be told, they're going to be dominated by primarily Protestant Northern Germany. Well, France has had a history of popes before. So, why not say that, maybe a conservative reactionary France brings Franco in power as part of some conservative Catholic Latin Avignon.
Move it back to Avignon.
Yeah.
Or, frankly, as we said, Italy feels both ways here. So you've got a northern Italy, a Milan and the Po River Valley that have these connections to Middle Europa. Then you've got southern Italy, which does what the Pope tells them, is more agricultural, is more backwards. I can say that because I got great grandparents from there. And maybe the Spanish Civil War is fought in Italy. Maybe Italy does not survive as a political entity.
Well, and that's,
they've only been together for 40 years. It's not unrealistic.
Yeah. It is. Yeah, it's not a.
And you have major groups within Italy being pulled towards these two poles here.
Yeah. At the very least, a north-south split with Italy is very easy to imagine.
And southern Italy being kind of basically south of Tuscany being the Catholic French aligned state.
So basically what it all comes down to is if Woodrow Wilson happens to smoke an extra pack a month in early 1917 and have a little bit too much fried chicken, we end up with a Catholic axis versus a monarchist Central European confederation in World War II.
And we haven't even really gotten into what happens to Russia. Because
oddly, Wilson was a pretty clean living guy. He didn't drink any alcohol or coffee. He didn't smoke anything like that. So, unfortunately, that's what I.
Are you coming out and saying that people that have admitted that have cardiovascular issues are safe eating as much Virginia ham as they want?
I'm not.
Okay. Not. So we've got something there that could do it.
So Wilson takes up heavy smoking. There's our fork.
Sure.
Well, he is from Virginia. It's tobacco.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he's from the Shenandoah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little. Well, okay. Yeah, he takes up moonshining, I guess.
Well,
Woodrow Wilson's a NASCAR driver.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've created a very different post World War I and into World War II scenario here, guys.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I think that's probably as good of a place to end it as we could tonight.
I think you're right. I think, yeah, we came in with a good plan, and it did not survive first contact with each other. So yeah, hopefully everyone enjoyed this episode. We're gonna try and come up with some more like kind of kismet, everything coming together for all of us. We do want to get the other Eric on for the ending of that other Soviet power grab. But we've got a couple of other ideas.
Yeah, Eric Bond had a
yes.
He had a very different sort of divergence, and we, you know, if those of you who listened to last week's episode will recall that, you know, Chris and I felt like it was different enough to warrant its own episode, and also different enough to warrant an episode when Eric was available. But you know, as many of you people who are listening know, that, you know, he has a day job that is often a night job, and so he wasn't available. So we'll do it on a time when he is available.
Yeah. So does anybody else have any other, you know, pressing comments to add, ideas? We have actually seen some people pop up on the Discord asking us when we're getting back to episodes. The episode you've heard Eric and I reference should have, you know, did publish today. This will hopefully publish Friday back at our normal schedule, and we're gonna, you know, we have day jobs. Hey, you know what? If you want to stop that, there's always Patreon. If not, we will talk to you guys next time. But just and I threw it at Eric last time. I'll throw it to Dylan this time. If one should come to a fork in the road, what should you do?
Stick it in some Virginia ham to see if it's done. And then take it out.
And yes, folks, that is the last time Dylan got to do the outro.
Everybody, you know what? Yes, because frankly, that is a waste of a good ham. It should be slow. It should be rubbed, and it should be slowly cooked.
Yes,
over a pit. And that's why Don never let Chris run an episode again. So
we're gonna have an episode at some point. This will be our outro, I guess. We're gonna have an episode of, you know, the Fork in Time team. What are our,
you know what?
Beats?
Stick a fork in
compare those.
Maybe it's stick a fork in time in it. That should be it. Yes.
Well, maybe we'll do this. Maybe we could do this as one of our live episodes, and we can talk about, you know, all of our various smoked meats and barbecue and things like that.
It would be a pork in time.
A pork in time.
Ooh, yeah. Yes, a pork in time, because pork is the only appropriate meat to barbecue. Hear that, Kansas and Texas?
No. Hard pass. Hard pass. One word brisket. Anyway.
Yeah. Funny thing though, I get to edit the sound, so we'll see if that makes it into the clip.
Oh boy.
Everybody, it's been amazing. We will talk to you guys at the next episode, where Dylan will be appropriately edited out to do the outro right. Look forward to that. Signing off. This is Chris, Dylan, and Eric.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.